Okay. What brought you to the University of Colorado Boulder?
Well, Bob Stake hired me at Urbana after I finished graduate school. And it was a wonderful university. And they were wonderful to me. And the stimulation for the very short time I was there with people like Bob and Jack Easley and Tom Hastings and Ernie House was tremendous. But it only took me a year to realize that I didn't want to spend my life in downstate Illinois. It was very grim. Sorry to those who enjoy it. And it was made worse by an ice storm that winter that cut the power for days on end. Excuse me. And I decided after 1 year that I wanted to leave. I could have left then. I had interviews at UCLA and Chicago and a couple other places. John Goodlad gave me a tour of Westwood in his Mercedes, and I became fixated on owning a Mercedes, which I did years later. And but I felt like I should at least give University of Illinois another year, which I did. And I was headed to a conference in '66 at UCLA, the same one where I interviewed during the conference. And the plane stopped. We didn't get off the plane, but I looked out in Denver, and I looked out the window and I saw the mountains and the snow on the mountains, and I knew my brother had moved to Denver as head of the YMCA just a couple years before that. And I had a friend at University of Colorado at Boulder, and when I got back to Urbana, I called him and I said, "Are there any jobs there?" And he said he would try to create one. Ken Hopkins, my collaborator and friend for all these many years. And sure enough, he pulled off the coup of all times. I was the first faculty member hired into that school who hadn't taught in the public schools. And at that time, that was seen to be in weaker places an absolute necessity. And since then, that's quite different at Colorado and at most other places. But so it was really a reaction to kind of the grimness of downstate of central Illinois that sent me to Colorado, and probably to be closer to my brother. And because the expectations were low. I've always enjoyed low expectations, and nothing more intimidating than people expecting a lot from you. So that's why I always change my field every 10 years or so and get rid of that field, because people are expecting too much, and go to something completely different. And
So you can always be highly exceeding.
that's right, yeah. Right. Or a flash in the pan.
Yeah. So did you go to Boulder with the assistant professorship then? Is that where you got tenure?
Yeah. And it'll be a bitter pill for young people to swallow now, to realize that in those days you spent 3 years as assistant professor and 3 years as associate professor, and then you were a professor. Now it takes much, much longer. Yeah. But it was a time where there were burgeoning enrollments of students and very few faculty, so you could write your own ticket. And so I went through those ranks. I think I was professor before I was 30. And after that, there's not much else. But
except for Regents.
Yeah.
Lori Shepard is one of your former PhD students at Boulder, and she defines you as a brilliant contrarian. There are even a few things you are against just because everyone else is for them. You read Habermas before it was fashionable to do so, and recognized the contributions of ethnographic research before other quantitative methodologists were so inclined. She remembers a time, though, when you and her husband raced downhill during a snow ski trip, and you were unwilling to stop or check your speed. There was also a timed crossword puzzle competition in which you both engaged for a week, and after you lost, you ran a significance test using the distribution of the daily times it took you both to complete those crossword puzzles, and concluded that the difference wasn't statistically significant enough. Seriously.
I think she's right, and it's very insightful. And I might have lost that crossword puzzle contest, but I won a couple others, which I won't get into. And yeah, there was a frightening race down a ski slope that almost ended up in a tree. I gave up skiing not too long after that, but contrarian is certainly true. I remember in Boulder, I spent 20 years at Boulder from like 66 to 86, and and I was pretty conservative politically because I was surrounded by very liberal thinking. Mm-hmm. And I even wrote an article for Buckley's National Review and read Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke and campaigned for a libertarian candidate for the city council, Jerry Van Sickle, who finished 28th out of 29 candidates, losing out to Jody of Jody's Sweatshop, an aerobics instructor. Mm-hmm. That was the end of my libertarian politics. Mm. And when I got to Arizona, all my political views, and especially after our marriage in '93, changed to being quite liberal. Mm. And that's certainly contrarian in the atmosphere of Arizona.
What brought you to ASU?
The desire to play tennis all the time. Mm. I'd had a string of successes professionally, I suppose, in the 70s and early 80s. And again, the rising expectations were becoming a problem for me. And I didn't know if I could live up to that the rest of my life. I started hitting tennis balls with some friends a little bit. Didn't like it at first. And then my type A personality took over. And I started playing tennis 3 and 4 hours every day. After 18 months, entered a tournament and won a little cup and was completely hooked. I became obsessed with the game and then couldn't tolerate the winters in Colorado where it was too hard to find court time. So I contacted friends at Arizona State and asked if there were any jobs available. It took some real doing. There wasn't a great appetite for outsiders in the college at that time. That was a long time ago. But I eventually got an offer and from a new dean, a brand new dean, Gladys Johnston, in February of '86, and took it with great trepidation. I thought I might die in the heat, or the dog I had at the time would probably die in the heat. And but I knew I'd be able to play tennis all year round. And that's what it was about. I really had no intention of being terribly active intellectually or academically. I thought I was kind of pretty much burned out at 46 or whatever I was. And I knew I could walk my way through elementary statistics courses until retirement. And so I decided that's the place to go.
And you met David Berliner, one of your good friends here.
I did indeed. He came the year after me, hired by the same dean who really turned the institution upside down.
He admits that he originally feared you, Jean Glass, the infant terrible. You got your degree a few years ahead of him. You were busy outproducing everyone in both quantity and quality and scholarship, and you didn't suffer fools with kindness, publicly criticizing some, attacking their ideas with gusto and quite publicly. He says over the years he lost this fear, but never his awe for your creativity and productivity. How did it come about that you became the associate dean under his leadership as the dean of ASU at the college?
David was, let's see, I'm trying to remember. There was I think an abrupt change in the deanship, probably in 1997 or so. I'm a little vague on it. And David was asked by the provost to take the deanship, maybe for a bit. maybe it was an indefinite period of time. When I heard about it, I think I was kind of jealous. Why didn't they pick me? Well, I had no talent in that area whatsoever. And I'm sure they had picked up on that somewhere. Maybe someone had told them. But I did envy the opportunity he was being handed. I didn't realize until later how much I should have envied it, because I think it was some of the greatest fun I had in the academic world was 4 years. But I bumped into him on the sidewalk outside the building one day, and I said, you should, there'd been a dust-up in the dean's office, and the only way to get rid of an undesirable character in the dean's office was to eliminate the position of associate dean for research. And I suspect everybody's memory's too vague now to put names to the story, which would be better that they not. And so the dean at that time eliminated the position. So for a couple of years, here was College of Education aspiring to be, visible and respected in scholarship and research without an associate dean for research. I thought that was not a good situation, but I think I also wanted not to be left behind and to be a little part of the action. So I said, well, why don't you let me be the associate dean for research? And he said yes. He was taking a flyer on that as much as I was. It was a great 4 years. I wish it had gone on longer. I'd have stayed longer if David had stayed longer, but I wouldn't stay without him. I kept telling him it was a marathon instead of a sprint. But he was a great sprinter. And he had had enough after 4 years. There were 4 wonderful years where great hires were made. I think the reputation of the college really grew. And from that vantage point, I came to really appreciate my colleagues and the faculty and the things they were up against, and their struggles and their accomplishments, and the sort of thing that faculty not engaged in the day-to-day business of the college aren't privy to, and they start to look at the college as, I'm working, but the guy on this side and the woman on this side, they're not working. And I realized that none of that's true, that by and large, these are really dedicated, hardworking people with a lot to offer. And it really changed my outlook about the college and the academic life. It was wonderful 4 years for me.
And a long life friendship as well.
Yeah.
Gustavo Fishman, another colleague of yours at ASU, describes you as one of the brightest scholars of your generation. But what many people don't know, and it is a secret that you keep very well, is how kind and generous you are. He also says that in your own idiosyncratic way, you two are quite funny. Casey Cobb, he's one of your former PhD students at ASU. He remembers nervously emailing you about coming to study with you at ASU. He sought you out from Maine. And you ended up sharing your office with him for 3 years as he studied. He said Linux-based servers, computers, all running in the background the whole time the two of you shared an office. He recalls a time when David Berliner was dean, and the three of you and a reporter discussed a charter school study on which he was working. And Chester Finn's name came up, and you turned to the reporter and said, "Have you ever seen Checker? I bet I could take him." "No, really, I could take him." He said the reporter didn't know how to react to you. He also poignantly points out that all the people with whom you come in contact learn from you, whether you intend it or not. And as I'm one of your former students, I couldn't agree with more, and I often tell others, and my own students now, it's an incredible educational experience simply to be in your presence, whether it's in a classroom or whether it's not, because you're constantly teaching us things. How do you define your role as not only an educational researcher, but an educator?
Wow, those are short of a funeral oration. We don't often hear things like that, and it was wonderful to hear some of them. I'm not a very good educator. I'm not a very good teacher. Many subject matters that I really like, I sometimes take real satisfaction in being able to present them in clear ways. But that's Laticour, who was president here for a while, used to talk about, I guess it's a common phrase about the sage on the stage versus the guide at the side, and I think I always played the sage on the stage. I was more interested in me and the ego of putting an idea out in a way that showed the brilliance of the idea and showed the brilliance of me in putting it out. The guide on the side is the true educator. And I've never been that, because I'm very uncomfortable in the presence of people fumbling and in presence of ignorance, and everyone, the whole business about teaching is that someone is ignorant of something and then you make them skillful or competent or knowing about something. And I'm very uncomfortable pointing out anybody's ignorance about something or even dealing with it or confronting it. So an educator, I don't think so, but a performer perhaps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Your audience might, I beg to differ on that one. I learned a lot, so as did he and many other students that you've had to come in contact with. In terms of significant accomplishments, you became the president of AERA, the American Educational Research Association, in 1975 at the age of 35. How did that come about?
Well, I was elected 2 years before, I think, or a year before perhaps, because you serve a year as president-elect.
So you're 33.
So I was probably 34, so it's very important to note.
We have the overestimate here.
That's right. Statistics plus or minus a year, it doesn't matter.
Standard year.
I think it came about, let's see, when I entered graduate school with Julian, the atmosphere was one of disrespect for education. That was the height of the era where the social sciences promised that they were going to solve all the problems of the world, including the problems of the schools. So the agenda was not to study education, it was to study psychology or anthropology, or in my case, statistics and mathematics. We were so naive. I mean, almost the month in which I showed up at Madison, February 1962, the two things had happened. The dean, Lindley Stiles, had withdrawn Wisconsin from NCATE, saying that NCATE was a conservative drag on innovation in their teacher training and whatnot. And the faculty of the School of Education had voted to abolish comprehensive exams in learning and instruction and philosophy and foundations. And I remember my professors in measurement and statistics celebrating. Finally, we're free of that useless stuff. So we went through graduate school calling ourselves mathematicians or statisticians, knowing nothing about education, actually looking down on it. The first day I showed up in Julian's office, he handed me a book to review for educational and psychological measurements. Written by a senior scholar. I was 20 years old and knew nothing. And here the message was, you can know as much as these people, you know. There's nothing to respect there. So the training I got was so specialized and so deep that it's the perfect training for sending somebody off to a elite university, you know, where they hire specialists. They don't hire generalists or educators, you know. And all the interviews I had when I got out of graduate school were focused on what I knew about the latent roots and vectors of the correlation matrix and Sylvester's law of inertia, and that's what was impressive to people. It was years before I learned anything about education or acquired any appreciation for it at all. But shortly after I did the book review with Julian in 1962, he said, why don't we write a statistics textbook? And it was my second year in graduate school, and we signed a contract with Prentice Hall. And I spent the next 6 years writing a statistics book that came out in 1970 finally. And it was a big hit. Because there wasn't a lot of competition back then, like there is now. The first 6 months' royalties from the book were enormous. I went out and bought a Mercedes and didn't even use up much of the royalties, and that's what publishing was, textbooks was like back in the olden days. You could grab a huge share of the market. That book captured a huge share of the market, probably because Julian's name was second author, and the Campbell Stanley chapter had come out a couple years before and was world famous, and so some of that fame was reflected onto me. Plus, AERA at the time was small, maybe 6, 8, 10,000 people or so, and I had a facility for remembering names attached to people's faces. So at the annual meeting, which would usually happen at a Pick Congress Hotel in Chicago in February, I was able to smile and say hello to most people and call them by first name. And so a couple years later, when ballots went out, my name was on it, and I got elected. And at that time, AERA was completely dominated by statistics and measurement people.
Mm-hmm. Your work on meta-analysis was named as one of the 40 studies that changed psychology. According to Bob Stake, this is your most significant accomplishment. He called it ingenious, not actually so great a human service, but it feeds the modernist's appetite and sometimes saves the postmodernist's skin. According to Laurie Shepard, its impact on education research and research in health-related fields has been simply extraordinary. How did meta-analysis come about, and any regrets?
No regrets. It came about in connection with the presidency of ARA. And the ARA president has to give an address, an hour-long address that is usually very well attended. And I think every president is terrified from the moment they get the message that they've been elected president 2 years before this address is to be given until that time when they deliver the address. And I was appropriately terrified. And all my thoughts were, what in the world do I talk about that equals the importance of this office and this occasion? Nothing ordinary would do. I was going to have come up with something amazing. And it so happened that at about that time, I was probably 8 years into my own psychotherapy, trying to unravel all the mess that my life had become up until the point when I finished graduate school. And it was quite a mess by 1965, by the time I was out of graduate school, and I entered into psychotherapy. And I had acquired quite an interest in psychotherapy and eventually studied it with a couple of mentors and did a brief internship and practiced for 4 or 5 years in the late 70s. But all I was reading in the literature at that time was that psychotherapy was the bunk. It was useless, it wasn't good for anything, all the research was a fraud. Most of this criticism was written by a guy named Hans Eysenck, a German expatriate British psychologist. And if that was true, then I just wasted 8 years, a lot of my time, and the thought that I was any better off than when I started was false if therapy was nothing. So I went to that literature myself, hoping to find out that psychotherapy wasn't the bunk. What I found was some really inept forms of criticism and synthesis, mostly narrative syntheses of individual studies, talking about whether something or other was significant at the 5% level or not. And much of the training I'd had in graduate school gave me a different perspective on those studies and on the whole problem of synthesizing a great deal of quantitative information. I took a chance and decided that I would give my presidential address on that, and one statistical view after another finally came together, and this stuff called meta-analysis came out of it. I remember presenting it in San Francisco at the St. Francis Hotel. It was in April. It was on the anniversary of the 1906, I think, San Francisco earthquake. It's probably 70 years later to the day. I didn't expect to rock the city to the same extent, but in fact, actually, I was afraid that when they dimmed the lights, there were about 1,000 people in this big audience. I was afraid that when they dimmed the lights and I put my slides up and went through my slide presentation of the results, which the results of the meta-analysis of psychotherapy outcome studies, I was afraid that when the lights came back up, I might be left alone here, or everybody might have exited. I didn't know if they had an appetite for something as kind of off-center as psychotherapy research. The lights came up, most people were around at the reception later. Some people I liked and respected came up and shook my hand. Decker Walker from Stanford said he understood it, thought it made sense. At a later presentation, Lee Kronbeck said it made some sense, a little bit of sense, not a lot. And that was a great eye-opener for me. And I did a few more things in it, some work on class size, and wrote a book about it, and then decided it's time to get out of here because expectations are rising. And
There we go again.
so I started playing tennis, actually.
Back to lowering the expectations again, right?
Yeah.